out as this session concludes, as well as the slides. So without further ado, we're going to really cover how to get started with event management specifically within ServiceNow. So whether you've started to implement event management or you have not yet, this is really going to dive deeper into the things you need to kick it off and be successful with it in your ServiceNow instance. So of course, we're going to walk through mostly the configuration steps, the components you need to set it up, to maximize it, customize it to your environment, especially for those monitoring tools that you may have. But we'll also touch on the skills that you need to implement it and keep it up and running. We'll leave you with some good materials to take home with you and keep the momentum going. But just a deeper dive into today's agenda, we're going to start with a recap of what event management does, the value it brings to our customers here at ServiceNow. We're going to also touch on the training paths available to you from a ServiceNow perspective to gain those skills, keep them up and running for this particular implementation. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about configuration. So both the manual steps, there's about 6 of them that need to be taken to configure event management and tailor it to your environment. So we're going to walk through each of those and what they entail. I'll show you those steps in my demonstration environment. And then we'll talk about guided setup as well to take a quicker approach to getting all those things configured. So just to get started with event management, that quick recap of the value it brings, really high level of how it works before we see it in detail today. The bulk of it at ITOM Health is really intended to help the IT operations folks in your organization to handle that overwhelming wave of alerts that is coming in at them from all angles. So a lot of data, a lot of events and alerts are coming in from the different monitoring tools that you have. And so we handle that by really aggregating that data to make it both manageable and actionable. So rather than spending time sorting through all that data that's not necessarily helping to deduce the root cause, we want to make sure that we're hitting our ops teams with data that's manageable and actionable to reduce that time to resolution. And so to really drive the attention to the things that are most important, we really have to prioritize connecting that monitoring data back to the service level, and then looking at this from the end user's perspective and prioritizing really what matters to them when it comes to keeping things up and running and optimizing the performance of the services that they're leveraging. So what things are affecting user experience? What is the overall service status across our organization? Having that visibility as well as the near real-time status of each of those components is going to be very, very valuable. So of course, deducing all that data is one part of the equation, the first part of the equation in our case. But when it comes to take action and remediate against those alerts that are coming in, we really want to leverage the automated workflow capabilities that ServiceNow is known for by presenting those workflows at the fingertips of our operations teams, so they can then take the relevant courses of action to solve the problems at hand. And again, kind of reducing that mean time to resolution, handling alerts, prioritizing accordingly, all of those really relevant metrics that are important to our operations teams. So over time, as our operations folks find the automated workflows that remediate best for specific events, the workflows start to prove themselves, we can really configure the system to run those workflows immediately as of alert generation, rather than waiting for that human interaction. So these remediations, whether it's to actually remediate on the host against the alert, for things like creating an incident right away, getting things directed to the right teams to take action, those things we're actually going to configure in our lab today to happen upon alert generation. So again, reducing that time to take action. And the last piece of this, as this knowledge sort of accumulates over time and the ops teams are getting more familiar with the workflows and automation capabilities available to them within this tool, not only is your operations team learning how to best leverage the system, but the system will also actually be learning from itself in this sort of continuous feedback loop that we see here, detecting what courses of action are most successful and where those are. So this is leading us to more proactive and intelligent remediation across the board here. We'll take a look at these today when we get to the demonstration environment as well, because we have quite a few of these workflows available out of the box to you today to activate and turn on. Now, to really deliver on this vision, as I mentioned, it does start with a lot of that data. And so ServiceNow is really prioritizing pulling in as much data as we can so we can get a clear and correct vision of your organization from a monitoring perspective, as well as when it comes to the CMDB. And so if you're familiar with ServiceNow discovery, orchestration, integration, we do leverage that same mid server that's relevant in those applications to make this connection back to ServiceNow, to really pull that data from your different monitoring tools across your environments into the ServiceNow ecosystem and CMDB. If you're not as familiar with the mid server yet, from a high level, it's agentless. It's a lightweight Java application that's essentially going to connect those external monitoring tools that you can see listed, some of those on the left. It's going to connect those monitoring systems back to the mid server that acts as that liaison tool, and then back into the ServiceNow ecosystem to push or pull that data into our environment to start doing the normalization that we're going to look at. So of course, we'll look at both push and pull connectors today. As I mentioned, we have quite a few of these connectors out of the box. We'll look at the full list in my environment, but you can see some of the ones we have out of the box available on the left here. One thing to note is that the data is being normalized before it's coming into the system. This is really going to help us to sift out any of those redundant, unnecessary events and messages, and that's what's going to be that first level filtering to leave us with a digestible number of actionable alerts. So again, we're reducing that noise. That's kind of our priority one, to prevent our ops teams from wasting time sorting through messages that aren't helping us get to that root cause. And I did mention the CMDB. We'll talk more about this, but essentially these alerts are also going to be bound to the relevant configuration items as found in the CMDB. And that's going to be really valuable in the sense that it's giving us that relationship information. It's giving us that visibility into, okay, this alert is coming in, it's talking about this host, but why does that matter to me? What else is that host impacted by across our entire digital estate? So that's really going to be very valuable visibility information here. And so as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of noise reduction that's going on. A big part of that is the automatic grouping and correlation of alerts. So not a lot of the alerts that are coming in are going to be standalone. For the most part, they're all going to be part of a larger issue here. And so we use several different methods to actually automatically group related alerts for that noise reduction. So walk through these quickly, but you'll see them in our environment today as well. The first one for temporal analysis, basically we're leveraging machine learning to find the patterns that come in historically over time. And then based on those trends that we're seeing, and again, this is machine learning, so it's running in the background, it's looking for those trends that have come in over time. It's looking for alerts that should be grouped. It makes sense for them to be grouped based on the historical data. And it's going to group those alerts that are essentially telling the same story. When it comes to topological analysis, again, this is a machine learning approach, but essentially the system is using CI-based patterns, and it's identifying things like causal relationships that tell the same story. So for example, when there's a database server that's out and there's 3 other servers that are directly dependent on that server, we don't need 50 different alerts to tell us that same thing. That's not helping us to pinpoint that root cause when we're getting lost in that level of noise. So it's going to automatically group those alerts based on the core primary alert, based on that core CI that, for example, that database server that the outage is affecting, and not necessarily overwhelming us with noise from the other related alerts. So looking for those CI relationships in the topological analysis. And then the last 2 methods of grouping these alerts for that noise reduction are less machine learning and more human defined. So just like it sounds, essentially at ServiceNow, we respect the fact that you have human experience of your staff, and they're able to identify the logical groupings that have taken place, should take place, based on your specific tools, your specific environment, things they have seen over time. And so you're able to refine those rules to reflect that. For example, okay, when alert A comes in, alert B always immediately follows it. Those 2 things should be grouped based on your team's expertise, and we'll be able to refine those in today's demonstration as well. And the last thing to note here when it comes to that grouping capability, semi-supervised learning, essentially techniques can always be tuned by your human staff who can identify, maybe an alert has been added to the wrong group, or there was a group that should be grouped with these 15 others and it wasn't recognized. That's really going to feed that machine learning to continuously improve for future performance. So although we're really leveraging machine learning to correlate these alerts to reduce that noise, everything can always be tuned and customized to your alert, and that's going to make the machine learning stronger over time. I just dropped a lot of information on you in a short few minutes here just to recap the value of event management and really why it's important for us. I'm going to pause here to check the chat here for any questions. If there's any questions, feel free to throw those in. Terry asked, what about timed events? Example, first event goes out but not responded to, and another alert happens every 15 minutes. So that's what's going to be called our flapping events. So if they keep happening, we can set some settings to actually address that, and happy to send out some documentation on the flapping settings that are configurable within event management. It'll be within our flapping section of our alert management documentation. I'll grab that link at the end here when we have a few more minutes. Any other questions at this point? We're going to get a bit more technical as we go on from here on out. All right. So to take a break from the event management overview, if that sounded like a lot, maybe you're not as familiar with the value that event management brings, this is brand new, we heavily recommend taking some sort of event management training before tackling the event management implementation process. These are the two options hosted by ServiceNow. So we have both a self-paced training option for event management, as well as an instructor-led option for event management fundamentals. I've personally taken the self-paced one. It's on your own time. You have a lab, it's extremely hands-on, but I know that the instructor-led gives you some opportunities to ask more detailed questions, custom questions based on your environment. So both are heavily recommended by ServiceNow, and our partners will send out these slides and the recordings for you to check out these links afterwards as well, but heavily recommended. So for the rest of our time here, we're really going to dive into the configuration aspect. Again, this is going to be a lot of information. Feel free to throw questions in as they come up, or we'll have some time at the end to talk through some of these things. But we're first going to go through what I call the manual approach to configuration. Essentially, this is going to be the route you'll want to take if you have a more customized environment. You really want to take your time, go through each of these steps and tailor it to your environment. We'll talk about the guided setup option to really, I don't want to say spoon feed, but give you some more support as you walk through these steps and remind you what each of these things need and what they are. So there's two options here. We'll go through the manual route first. And so from a high level here, there are 6 high-level configuration steps to have the configuration of event management. We'll go through each of these in detail, but essentially this whole process is going to start with making sure you have the event management plugin active and ready to go in your environment. So if you're not 100% sure that you have event management licensed in your ServiceNow environment, make sure you talk to me, to your rep. We'll get you connected with the people who can get you that answer if you are licensed for this capability or not. But if you are licensed or you're going to be soon for event management, you still need to go ahead and submit that request on the Now Support portal to get that event management plugin up and running in your designated ServiceNow instance. So that's going to be the first step. If you're not seeing any of these other steps, you probably need to go back and check for that plugin. So once we have our event management plugin ready to go, we do need to make sure that you have that validated mid server installed and active. So as I mentioned, this may sound familiar if you've leveraged ServiceNow Discovery, orchestration, or integrations before that use a mid server. It's the exact same application, but we're using it with the event management function. So as you can see, a couple of best practices that we have on this screen, it is recommended to have each mid server designated with a single purpose. So in this case, if you already have mid servers that you're leveraging for discovery, it's probably going to be best that you spin up a new mid server and designate it for event management separately. That's going to give you that best performance when it comes to ingesting all this data that we're going to put together. So have that mid server up, have event management active on it as the primary function. You can deploy a mid server both on Linux or Windows. Depending on your environment, this may vary, but as a best practice, we typically recommend installing that mid server on a Windows server because it's really going to maximize the host and areas that can be discovered on it and ingesting that data based on the host, versus Linux is typically limited to other Unix hosts. We have some additional best practices here. We'll send this out, as well as the detailed documentation on installation instructions for mid servers and these other best practices. But essentially, once you have that plugin active, you will need an event management mid server active, validated, and ready to go. So with that mid server serving as that liaison point for the data ingestion, we're going to look at how to set up these event source connectors. So these are basically those push and pull connectors that we looked at briefly in our slides that are connecting ServiceNow via that mid server to your monitoring tools that you already have. And so a lot of these connectors, as we'll see the full list in just a moment, are going to be out of the box. We've really built out quite a list of out of the box event source connectors based on the monitoring tools that are most common across our customers. That will be a growing list, but you can customize these connectors as well to monitoring tools that don't already have an out of the box connector available. And we'll look at that in my instance to see what that means. One best practice to note here, as you're setting up these event source connectors, it's very critical to work with your monitoring tool teams, whoever is managing these different monitoring tools that you'll be connecting to in your organization, to make sure you have the correct connection parameters. We'll see when we set this up in a moment what that means for different monitoring tools. But each of these connectors is going to require those connection parameters and credentials so that ServiceNow can actually access these different event tables across your different tools. At SolarWinds, at Zabbix, those different areas, we need those credentials to be correct in order to have this information digested. So make sure you're not doing this in a siloed approach. So once we have our event data starting to be ingested via those connectors, and I do want to pause at that point to call out, using our mid server, there are various options, which we'll talk about, using the mid server as an SNMP trap, setting up APIs. So there's a few different options to ingest the data, but the mid server is going to be required for each of those. Once we have our data starting to be ingested into our events table in ServiceNow, this is where we want to start to think about our event rules. So essentially, this is talking about, okay, based on all these events coming in, now I just have one database of all of my events from all these different siloed monitoring tools. But as I mentioned, our base value of event management and of ITOM health is to reduce that noise. And so we really want to make sure that we're setting these rules to say, based on all these events coming in from our connectors, what should determine if an event should escalate into an alert? Common things that we see in these rules, and again, we have quite a few out of the box that we'll look at, but we see a lot of thresholds, CI-based alerting, and this is all contributing to that noise reduction benefit. And as a best practice, we do recommend leveraging the out-of-the-box rules available to start out, and you can customize, of course, but we'll show you on the demo how to actually leverage those out-of-the-box event rules based on the monitoring tools that you're using. Now we're kind of building up the ladder here. So once we have our events coming in, we have those event rules to really dictate, based on these criteria, based on these rules, what should actually be important enough to become an alert that's actionable to my alert management team, my operating team. Once you've defined that and what generates an alert, you want to define the specifics of what alerts actually do and really start to leverage that automated workflow capability that I mentioned the Now platform has invested so much in. So for example, what automatically happens when certain alerts are generated? And things that we see quite a bit are things like, okay, based on specific alert criteria, we need to have an incident be created right away. We need to get our incident response team looped in, our incident management team, or things like automatically kicking off specific remediation workflows at the host, depending on that criteria of the alert. So there's a lot that we can do here to automate upon alert generation to, again, really speed up that time to resolution, get the right teams involved, or in some cases, even remediate automatically if it's a time-sensitive alert. We have a lot of out-of-the-box options to support here again, so we'll look at those alert management rules that we've created out of the box for you to tune and activate as well. So lots of out of the box here for you to leverage, and that's probably a trend you've noticed. We definitely recommend leveraging the out of the box resources available before you start to customize. We have some detailed links that we'll send out to you. No need to jot these down. And the last thing I'm going to note here before we go into the demonstration, and again, we're going to recap each of these steps in the instance, so you'll be able to see a bit more information about it. But lastly, we've defined what generates an alert, what happens when these alerts are generated. But essentially now we need to define the alert correlation rules. And so again, that's that last type of that. I talked about those different approaches, those machine learning approach that actually group these alerts for that second level of noise reduction. So this is how your teams can leverage that customization capability to really tailor how things are grouped, how these alerts are grouped, primary versus secondary. These are going to be called those alert correlation rules. And again, this method, this more human-based approach to alert correlation is in addition to those AI-based correlation and that CMDB correlation method. And the last thing, so when an alert is in maintenance mode, we definitely don't want, or excuse me, when a CI is in maintenance mode, I should say, we don't want to have a bunch of false alerts, unnecessary alarm coming into our operator workspace just because something is in maintenance versus being actually down. And so by default here, basically any CI that has an active change window is going to be automatically marked as being in maintenance status. And those alerts based on that CI are going to go ahead and be suppressed within that change window. So even if alerts are coming into the operator workspace, they'll go ahead and be suppressed due to that change window being open, due to it being in maintenance mode. And you can, of course, customize those maintenance rules, turn that default status off under the maintenance rules within the event management module. I'm going to pause here before we go into the demonstration. Any questions on any of those configuration steps before we kind of recap and see those in the environment? All right, looks like none so far. I'm going to switch over my screen here to my demo environment. Please let me know if at any point this becomes too small or glitches for you. I want to make sure we can all see this clearly. But in my demo environment, I'm going to skip over those first two phases of the configuration. So at this point, I'm assuming I already have my event management plugin active installed to my environment. Again, you're going to want to request that through the Now Support portal if you haven't already. In my environment, that's active, ready to go. And I've already gone ahead of time and installed my mid server on my network. That's again been a dedicated mid server to event management. So I've done those first two steps, and I'm going to hop to the third step of configuring event management. So at this point, I want to start ingesting that data across my different monitoring tools to get that into ServiceNow, which is going to be done, as I mentioned, it can be done a few different ways. You can have the mid server serve as an SNMP trap. You can set up custom APIs, but the easiest and most common way is going to be to leverage these connector definitions to get those push and pull connectors, transferring and ingesting that information from your monitoring tools into ServiceNow. So what we're looking at here, these are our different connector definitions. So you can essentially think of these as templates or forms that have been pre-built by ServiceNow based on our most popular monitoring tools that we see across our customers. So it's quite a long list. We have about 22 out of the box today. So you can see some names you may recognize, SolarWinds. Today we'll set up one for Zabbix. And so again, think of these as templates. And if I click into, for example, my Zabbix connector definition, you can see the fields that have been predefined by ServiceNow in this out-of-the-box template. So there's not a lot for us to do here. Well, I'll show you how to connect my credentials to this and tell it to connect specifically to my Zabbix environment. But a couple of things to call out here that you'll see within these pre-built connector definitions, and if you customize your own. So you're going to want to set a value for the default schedule. Essentially, this is telling it, this connector, how often to check that event table at the source and check for new events to bring into ServiceNow. Generally, that's going to be set similar to this one at 120 seconds. So essentially every 2 minutes, this connector is going to be reaching back into that Zabbix event table, looking for new events to bring in and ingest into ServiceNow. As I scroll down here, you can see any connector instances that I've gone ahead and used this definition to actually connect to my Zabbix environment, which we'll look at in just a moment. So I can track any specific connectors I've actually activated based on this format. And with our parameters table here, I can see exactly what ServiceNow needs to go ahead and establish this connection to Zabbix in this case. So as soon as I test my connector instance, which I'll do in just a moment, it's going to be looking for these parameters to actually go ahead and establish this connection to Zabbix. And again, in this case, because it's an out-of-the-box connector definition, this has all been pre-built out for me. So now what I want to do is actually create an instance of that connector to tie it back to my actual Zabbix environment and start ingesting those events. So I've gone to my connector instances. This would be where you're going to create a new actual connector based on those definitions or based on your own. So for the sake of time, I've gone ahead and put a Zabbix connector together for us. And so in opening that up, to connect this back to that list of connector definitions we were just looking at, the first thing you're going to do when you create a new connector instance is actually select which connector definition you're leveraging. So if I click this field, I can see that same list we were just reviewing. If you customize your own connector definition, it'll be on this list as well for you to select. And by selecting which connector definition you want to leverage to put this connector together, that's what's going to tell this form what specific data points it needs to actually get this up and running. So I've given it a name. I've given it my host IP in this case for Zabbix specifically. And again, this is why we really emphasize working with your monitoring teams, with the teams that are managing these different monitoring tools in your organizations, because they're going to be the ones who hold the keys to this information. They have the parameters and credentials that you need to set this up successfully. And if this does not validate, you will not be able to ingest this, the event data that's coming in. So connection parameters, you'll want the credentials as well. Depending on the type of definition you're leveraging, the tool you're leveraging, it's going to prompt you with these different forms for the type of credentials and credential fields that are needed. We also have some pretty extensive documentation on credentials and how they work within ServiceNow. And then again, all those same parameters that we were just looking at. And the last component here, that mid server, again, as I mentioned, that second step in setting this all up, basically a prerequisite, is to have that mid server enabled with event management and ready to go, because you're going to need to select that liaison point for this connector to run. So I'm going to go ahead and test my instance connector. Again, this is going to be required for that data to start ingesting into your environment. So because I had the correct connection parameters, I had the correct credentials that I've gotten from my tool team here. The last thing you want to do to start actually ingesting that event data from, in this case, our Zabbix environment, is go ahead and actually activate this particular connector instance. And that's going to start ingesting this data into ServiceNow every 120 seconds based on our connector definition that it was defined in. We have a question in the chat. Is there documentation on external connections using credentials? Absolutely. So we do support CyberArk, and we do support a few other third-party credential stores. When we pause at the end here for questions, I'll grab that link as well and throw it in the chat for you all on that third-party credential store. Absolutely. So now that we've gotten our connector, it's tested successfully, we've activated it, that data should start ingesting from the source I've connected it to. So I'm going to go to where that data should be landing, which is our all events table under the event management module here. So this table is not going to be what you think of when it comes to alerts. This certainly is not the operator workspace that our ops team should be working out of. This is really going to be the table you go to for that raw event data. So this is typically only going to be a concern for our event management teams versus others are only going to be really concerned about those actionable alerts after that noise reduction has taken place, which we'll also talk to. But essentially, when you want this raw event data, this is where you can find it. And so as we can see, just today alone from this one tool that I have, or a couple tools I have connected in my environment, we have over almost 5,000 alerts, or events that are coming in. So this is again why that noise reduction can be incredibly important, especially at a commercial enterprise level. So sifting to my Zabbix source with that connector that we just reviewed, and that's flowing into ServiceNow, I can actually see going over to our right-hand column, while these are our events that are coming in from Zabbix, I can actually see going all the way over to the right, if and when it has actually escalated into an alert. And that's going to be leveraging those event rules that we talked about briefly in the slides, and we're going to talk about a bit more now. I'm going to first click into that actual event record. And in this case, this event has been processed and turned into an alert, as we saw in that right-hand column. So a couple of things I want to call out about this event form here. So for every raw event that we click into from that table, you can see it's in a pretty clean format given its raw event data. So connectors in the background are actually mapping the raw data points from coming in from the tools from Zabbix into the fields we see here. And we'll deep dive on that in just a few minutes as well. But a couple of fields to call out for my event management folks on the line here. First thing we want to look out for when we're looking into our actual event records is the state. So in this case, this is how we're able to see that first level filtering that's being applied. In this case, this event has been processed. It's been compared to event rules to determine if it should become an alert, if it should be added to a group of alerts or not. And so again, that's that noise reduction at the event level that's taking place. And in our processing notes here at the bottom, we can actually see exactly what logic is taking place from the time the event is being pulled into ServiceNow. So we can see at the bottom here in this case, okay, it was processed, an event rule was applied, which is what made it into an alert. It did meet the criteria of that event rule to be escalated to an alert, an actionable alert, whether that's on its own or added to a group, we'll see in just a moment. But we can actually see what specific event rule has been applied. And just to emphasize here, as we mentioned, the best practice is to start with some of these out-of-the-box event rules just to get started. But as you begin to customize against these event rules and creating your own, this is going to be really important for you to actually monitor how those new rules that you're tuning and creating are actually being applied to the different events that are coming in. Last thing on this is this additional information area. So anything else that's coming in from the tool that goes beyond these defined fields, and again, we'll look at how to actually map this data and customize this, but anything else that hasn't been explicitly mapped to come into these fields, it's going to fall into this table here, or this box here, I should say. And essentially, this can be really good information just in the event that you want to identify some additional filtering as you're creating your event rules. You can identify some trends in this box as well, based on this additional information that's coming in from, in this case, the Zabbix tool. So our event rules are being applied here to escalate into an alert. So we're going to take a look at some of those event rules and the out-of-the-box options available to you to kind of customize, create your own, or tune the available event rules. So these are event rules across the different sources that are out of the box. So quite a few, as you can see, whether it's AWS as a monitoring tool, we have, I think it's almost 200 of these out-of-the-box event rules for you to leverage. So sticking with our example today, I'll go ahead and look up Zabbix as my source for these event rules. And so even for Zabbix alone, I have quite a few event rules out of the box that I can activate in my environment, tune, just to make sure, again, we're going back to that noise reduction to define from an event that's coming in, from those 4,000, 5,000 events coming in, of those, what should become an actionable alert for my teams to actually spend time on. So clicking into one of these Zabbix out-of-the-box event rules, we can see really what it takes to configure a rule on your own, or even to review and start to activate some of these out-of-the-box options. So for each of our event rules, whether, again, you're creating your own or reviewing some of these options, you'll give it a name, you'll give it an order of operations. But really what you're going to want to spend some time on here is this event filter part. So essentially, just like it sounds, you're essentially filtering out which specific events should be picked up by this filter and therefore the rule applied to. So in this case, this out of the box rule is saying any event that comes in from Zabbix and has a classification of metric and has an application's name of CPU or performance. And again, when you're creating these different criteria, you can see on the right here, our event input. It has several fields that typically come in around our Zabbix events and the common value examples that it sees for each of those fields. So this can really help you to tailor when you're creating your own filters for what event should actually be escalated in this case. This can also be fairly dynamic. So for example, if I add a new criteria and I want to say on an event's description, maybe it's not anything so explicit, but it does match a regular expression. You can be fairly dynamic with these criteria that you're setting here. So things like matches a regular expression, you could type that out. You have the option to make it match a pattern. So there's a lot you can do here to actually customize these filters in terms of what you set to be an event to an alert criteria. And as a last note here, of course, if you want to create explicit ignore rules, by default, all events, if they do not match an event rule, they're still going to be escalated to alerts by default in the system. That is the case so that if any new one-off events are coming in and they don't match any of your explicitly defined event rules, they're still going to get promoted to you to take action on or decide what to do with them in the future. They're not just lost in the noise. So this is where event rules become really important, to have that noise reduction, even if it's just these explicit ignore rules. Hey, your ops team is saying that a bunch of events came in, it's not anything relevant for them, no actions needed. You can create these filters to make sure they're no longer escalated to the alert level. So once we've set our filter here, this is what's going to kind of go back to that data mapping concept that I mentioned when we looked at our raw event form and how that data actually maps from the monitoring tool table into these forms that we have for both events and alerts to make sure we have the information we need in the right places. Again, kind of speeding up this time to resolution, making sure teams have the info they need it, where they need it to start to act accordingly. And so you can really map, customize how this works to actually map where the data is going in these desired variables. And so again, looking at our right-hand column, we still have those data pills for the expected data, in this case, coming in from Zabbix to pull over and match the data to these different variables on our alert form to give us the data we need. And then second to last step here, going ahead and adding a threshold to our event rule if it makes sense. So essentially, for example, let's say we only want this event to become an alert if it happens, let's say 4 times within 2 minutes. If it happens 1 time within 2 minutes, based on what our teams know, that's probably fine. But if it happens more than that, it's probably an anomaly and we want to be notified about it at an alert level. So you can add thresholds. You can also similarly add idle thresholds. If it idles after it generates for another 2 minutes, 5 minutes, you can go ahead and have it close out. So lots to do there when it comes to thresholds and the filtering to really customize these rules according to your environment. And the last thing here has to do with binding. So essentially, this is the logic that binds these events and alerts coming in, all those data points that we just looked at in that form, to the configuration items within your CMDB. That's what's giving us that CI visibility, that business level visibility, to really make sure we're looking at a service map in ServiceNow, but not only are we seeing the configuration items, but also their near real-time status when it comes to monitoring. So when it comes to this particular setting, we typically recommend you leave this alone as much as possible, because this logic is built in to really bind to those CIs as these events and alerts are coming in. But just want to note what that is here first. Any questions on event rules and how that first level filtering works to escalate into alerts? All right, nothing coming in so far. I'll keep an eye on our chat here. So the last thing I want to note when it comes to event rules before we go on to our alert management section of this is at the top here, we have a machine. I see one question come in. Is it on the CMDB CI table or is it class specific for the CIs? So it's actually going to be at the whole CMDB level. So if it's it's going to map based on the host that it's monitoring for, it's going to map to that particular CI regardless of where it is in the CMDB. So it's at kind of that wider level. Last thing to note here, at the top of our event rules application, we see this bar at the top. This is again going to be more of a machine learning capability here. Basically, this logic banner is using machine learning to examine all of our events that have been coming in. And it's actually going to be recommending out of all of these out of the box rules, because there are a lot, it's going to look across those out of the box rules. And based on our events that it's analyzing, let us know which of those rules based on our event data might be best for us. So we can click in there, machine learning saying, hey, we analyzed all the events you've gotten in from Zabbix or your other connecting sources. We want to recommend these couple of rules for you to consider activating in your environment. So that might be a good place to start to review your recommendations once you have your events starting to be ingested. All right, so for one of our last things we're going to take a look at is when it comes to the alert management rules. Let me shift over there. So now that we've defined based on an event what should become an alert, we really want to define that automation capability. So we have that first level noise reduction going on. We're filtering what should be in our operator workspace. Now we want to define what can actually happen as of alert generation to really leverage that automation capability. So a couple of those that we see most often are things like I mentioned, creating an incident automatically, creating a security incident automatically, or even things like actually remediating, going to that host where that alert is coming in from and actually remediating with a specific workflow that we've built out, or even one of these out of the box options. So we have several out of the box options as well for our alert management rules to have some of this automatic logic kick off upon alert generation. So we'll look at the most common one we see our customers turning on right away, which is our create incident on primary out of the box alert rule. So now that we've opened that up, essentially these are pre-built flows to, again, just like it sounds, open that incident automatically based on the details of our alert group. So right away, and again, if you're creating your own, it'll look very similar to this. You'll fill in these data fields. But if I scroll down, I can actually see the times that this particular workflow was kicked off based on my alerts. So I can see all the executions of this particular automated flow. But very similar to our event rules when we're creating these filters, we're again filtering the logic to focus only on the alerts groups to where the criteria is met before it kicks off this automatic workflow. So in this case, with this pre-built option, basically it's saying any alert groups that have a critical severity and have an empty task in them, aka nothing has already been set to kick off from a workflow perspective, we want to go ahead and qualify that, and we want to use all the data from that primary alert in the group. So not the secondary, not the later alerts, but that primary alert in the group. We're going to use data from that one, if this criteria is met, to kick off this incident creation workflow that we've built out already. So again, you can modify the filter criteria, but that's going to really filter out and select the alerts that are qualifying for this automatic workflow remediation. And so our last step of this automatic workflow remediation actions, this is really where the rubber is going to meet the road in terms of what action is kicking off. And usually this is going to be a flow designer workflow to really dictate what action is taking place. Again, this is all out of the box in this case. So go ahead and click to open that workflow here. And so as that's loaded here, we're leveraging, because this is a create incident example for that out of the box alert management rule, I want to call out that as a best practice, as you're customizing these flows for alert management or for other areas of ServiceNow, always make sure that you're copying the subflow before you modify any of the fields, just so you're not impacting other areas of the organization that may be leveraging this particular core flow. So I'll go ahead and do that, give it a version. And this will create a copy of this flow for us to start to customize and tailor for the correct teams that we want to create this incident for. If we want to, again, you can leverage this out of the box, but as you'll see when we're actually creating the task, open that up here. As we're creating this task, so in this case, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but we're kicking off this remediation flow. So when the alerts meet the criteria we've defined in the filter, we want to kick off this flow automatically to create the incident. So create task is where the meat and potatoes of this task is going to be. So you can see out of the box with this flow, we're pulling data already from that primary alert in the group. This has all been predefined. So as we're creating these data fields on the incident record that's being created, the data will match up to the fields coming in from that primary alert. Again, the importance of data pills and having that data coming in from Zabbix correctly. But if we want to customize this to really customize how our incident is created and who it's going to, we can do that here in the subflow that we're looking at now. So for example, I can do things like maybe the assignment group. I don't see that on here already. I can really customize who within my incident management team and organization should be responsible for this particular incident based on maybe some of the data pill criteria of my alert. And again, I can keep this dynamic, maybe the assignment group, that's going to be assigned based on a regex expression, based on a scripted variable using these data pills here. So definitely not a requirement to do that, to customize these as you're leveraging these out of the box workflows. You could run this as is, and you can review exactly where that data is coming from when it's launching this incident. But just to note, there's a lot of customization that can take place. And most of the time, this is going to be out of that flow designer workflow that's really kicking off this action that's taking place. I'm going to shift back over to our slides. Feel free to keep the questions coming as we're coming up towards the end of our presentation here. Just one thing to note on that, as you're leveraging those workflows and making things happen automatically, make sure you're remembering to keep in contact with your other teams. So if you're making an incident, go to your incident management team, you're kicking off a security alert, or excuse me, a security incident, make sure you're leveraging those teams to see what processes they may already have in place. And the last thing I'm going to talk about quickly here before we wrap up and have some time for questions is that guided setup approach that I mentioned. So the guided setup option is just going to offer you some extra support and really walk you through step by step those same steps we just went through. And then as you get more familiar, as you have the training that you need to be comfortable with event management, you can certainly always access those same applications, same modules that we went through today to kind of tune and refine. So essentially, guided setup is going to get you the same achievements that we just walked through today. It's just a bit simpler of an interface. But to note, the technical prerequisites for using that guided setup approach that we'll look at in just a moment in my environment, this should look pretty familiar to you. You still want to make sure you have that event management plugin requested and active, ready to go, as well as that mid-server setup for event management. And make sure before you begin guided setup that you've worked with your monitoring teams and you have the credentials and connection information for at least one of your event sources that you'll be connecting to, because you'll still need those credentials and parameters to establish those connectors that we looked at. So switching back over to my instance for the last time here, I'll show you what that guided setup looks like and where that lives. So you'll just want to search ITOM guided setup. And essentially, it's really just going to walk you through each of the phases that need to be configured in order to have event management up and running. So you can see it even will walk you through that mid-server configuration task. That's a prerequisite. We have ITOM guided setup for discovery, but for the sake of today's presentation, we're really going to hone in on this event management module here. And it's going to walk you through to configure. You'll click into this. It will give you the step-by-step guide to do things like configure the connectors for your different monitoring tools, set up those event rules to escalate accordingly, map the data as we looked at, and give you some support and resources as you walk through that. So giving you some guidance along the way. And so regardless of if you're leveraging the guided setup approach or that manual approach that we walked through earlier on, we heavily recommend consulting with the different teams in your organization. We have some core recommendations on the screen here, but making sure you're not doing this in a silo, making sure you're not putting yourself in a box. Talk to your security team, talk to your monitoring teams, especially as there are credential requirements, things like we had in the question about external data stores. Make sure you understand your organization's rules and posture around that before you begin this process. And of course, as you're doing things like incidents and event management, of course, loop in those teams and work with them as well. So just to wrap up here in our last few minutes, key takeaways, right? We really want you to connect to those monitoring tools, maximize the data that you're bringing into ServiceNow, because the whole value of event management of ITOM Health is to pull that data in, give you that single source of truth, give you visibility across your organization, across those hosts, and make sure you can remediate accordingly. And you can't do that unless you have full visibility of the monitoring status and of your organization. So connecting to those monitoring tools to get that data correlation in. Make sure you have those proactive operations, reduce the noise, set up those event rules so you have only meaningful and actionable alerts hitting your operator workspace to reduce that noise and that meaningless time sorting through data that's not necessarily helping to get to that root cause and remediate. Automating with those alert rules, really taking advantage of those automated workflows that we looked at. And then of course, if you want to leverage that guided setup to get started, that will really speed up the process of going through the configuration. Again, we'll send this out as well as the recording. We do have some additional resources for you here, as well as quite a few links throughout the slides that we went through. So we'll send out the slides with all of those hyperlinks available to you. But with that, that comes to the end of our presentation. I'm going to stick around for a few minutes to answer any questions that may trickle in. But if you have to jump and do the rest of your day, thank you so much for attending our event management how-to clinic. There should be a survey that pops up as you close out of this webinar, if you wouldn't mind spending a few minutes answering those questions. But other than that, best of luck on your event management journey, and please let me know if you have any other questions or concerns. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll stay on for a few minutes to answer some questions that came in here. So it looks like there is one question that came in, why subflows and not core flows? So you can certainly leverage the core flows as you're building out those alert management rules. However, if you're modifying those fields and you're customizing it, it's just a best practice to copy a subflow so that you're not interrupting any other areas of the platform that's leveraging that same core flow. Any other questions coming in from the chat and QA? All right, not seeing anything else coming in. With that, I'm going to stop the share, close out of the webinar. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and week. Thank you so much again for attending. Feel free to email with any additional questions, and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.